So I've been thinking about Star Wars theories again. I say again, like it's something I do periodically, but honestly, it's more of a constant background hum at this point. There's always some corner of the lore I end up circling back to at odd hours, usually late at night, when everything else has gone quiet, and my brain quietly decides that now is actually the perfect time to reconsider whether Jar Jar Binks was secretly the most dangerous being in any room he ever walked into. Which, as it happens, is exactly where we're starting tonight. Star Wars is one of those rare universes where the theories never really stop being interesting, and I've thought quite a bit about why that is. Part of it is that George Lucas deliberately built the whole thing around mystery and suggestion. There are things that happen before the films, centuries of Jedi and Sith history, a Clone War mentioned in passing by a character who sounds like she's referring to something every adult knows about. There are things happening off-screen during the films, things hinted at in a single line of dialogue and never followed up on. The prequels added another enormous layer of that. The animated shows, and I will go to my grave insisting that The Clone Wars is quietly one of the richest things in the entire franchise, added several more layers on top. And now, after decades of films and television, and novels and comics and games, the lore has become this vast, beautifully tangled thing that rewards people who want to dig into it. Which I do. Frequently? Probably too frequently. You can watch A New Hope as a fairly self-contained adventure film about a young man, a princess, a smuggler, and a war against a galactic empire. That's fine. That's genuinely a wonderful film. But the moment you start pulling threads, who was Obi-Wan Kenobi before we met him? What did Darth Vader actually do during those 19 years between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope? What is the Force at a fundamental level? And does it have something like a will? The whole thing opens up into something much stranger and stranger still. And then there's the other reason theories thrive in this fandom, which is that some of the official explanations are, to be kind about it, a bit unsatisfying. Not all of them. Some of the canonical answers are genuinely excellent. The Clone Wars series resolved mysteries in the prequel films in ways that were better than I'd hoped, but some answers are lacking. Padme Amidala, one of the most determined and capable characters in the prequels, dying of a broken heart while a medical droid watches and fails to identify being very sad as the cause. Snoke being introduced across 2 films as this ancient, powerful, terrifying dark side figure and then dispensed with before we learn anything of substance about him. These gaps invite theories the way a gap in a fence invites people to look through it. There's a theory about why Padme really died that I find considerably more emotionally coherent than anything the films gave us. There's a theory about Snoke's true identity that would have connected the sequel trilogy back to the prequels in a way that felt like a complete story. We'll get to both, but mostly what I love about Star Wars theories is that the best ones aren't about pointing out plot holes. They're about depth. They're about noticing that a character behaves oddly in a scene, or that a line of dialogue doesn't quite make sense unless you assume the speaker knows something they're not saying aloud. The best theories make you watch films you've seen dozens of times and find something genuinely new in them. That's a remarkable thing. There's also something I find quite lovely about how collaborative Star Wars theorizing is. These ideas get passed around online, refined, debated, built upon. Some originated in forum posts from the early 2000s, some came from a single Reddit thread that went inexplicably viral. Some have been circling the fandom since before the internet existed, passed between fans at conventions and in letters and in hushed conversations at the back of a cinema. The galaxy far, far away has always been a shared imaginative space, and the theories are part of how people inhabit it. Tonight we're going to wander through quite a few of them. There's no particular order and no destination we're building toward. Each section is its own self-contained thing, and you can drift off at any point without missing a grand conclusion because there isn't one. Just a lot of pleasant wandering. Some of these theories are vast, sweeping ideas about the nature of the Force itself, about the shape of thousands of years of Sith and Jedi history. Some are smaller and more specific: a bounty hunter and a burning homestead, a droid who has been keeping a considerable secret since 1977, a Gungan who might have been the most dangerous individual in every room he ever entered. A quick note on my approach: where something is confirmed canon, I'll say so. Where it's fan theory, I'll say that. And where I personally think a theory makes more narrative sense than the official explanation, which does happen, I will tell you that quite directly, because I've never been good at hiding my Star Wars opinions. Something I should probably mention up front: I love these films with the particular tenderness reserved for things that were important to you at a formative age and have somehow continued to hold up to scrutiny in adulthood. That combination, the nostalgia and the continued genuine interest, makes me a fairly partial narrator. I'll try to be fair to all of it: the prequels, the original trilogy, the sequels, the animated material, but you should know going in that I have a soft spot for the prequels that I've given up defending and now simply accept about myself. Some of the lore we'll discuss tonight is prequel lore, and I make no apologies. I also want to say something about what theories are and what they're for, because I think it matters. A theory is not a correction. It's not a demand that the official story be different. It's a form of love, really. An act of spending more time with something you care about, finding more in it than the surface offers, building meaning out of gaps and suggestions. The people who theorize most intensely about Star Wars are not the people who like it least. They're the ones who can't let go. And there's something rather lovely about a story that inspires that kind of sustained creative attention across decades. If you'd like to subscribe while you're getting settled, that'd be lovely. Right then, let's start with the one I always end up thinking about first. Jar Jar Binks is, in the official Star Wars story, a well-meaning Gungan from Naboo whose defining characteristics are extreme clumsiness, a comedic accent, and an apparently bottomless capacity for stumbling into situations that accidentally benefit the people around him. He is, by design, comic relief. He was also, upon his introduction in The Phantom Menace in 1999, one of the most controversial characters in the franchise's history, widely criticised, frequently cited as the worst thing about the prequels, and ultimately sidelined in later films as a result of that reaction. And yet here we are, decades later, seriously discussing whether he was a Sith Lord. The Darth Jar Jar theory began, fittingly, as a joke. The comedy series Robot Chicken did a Star Wars special in 2010, in which Jar Jar is revealed to have been orchestrating everything all along. A parody gag, nothing more. But then, in November 2015, a Reddit user called a Lumpawaroo posted something rather different. A long, carefully structured argument, full of specific scene references and character analysis, suggesting that Jar Jar Binks had originally been written as a hidden Sith villain, a dark mirror to Yoda's famous disguise on Dagobah, and that the plan was scrapped when audiences reacted so badly to the character that making him a secret mastermind would have felt like rewarding someone they already hated. That post got an extraordinary amount of attention. It was shared everywhere, and the reason it landed so well wasn't just because it was a fun idea, it was because the evidence, when laid out carefully, is genuinely difficult to dismiss. Let's start with the movement thing, because this is where the theory gets interesting. Throughout The Phantom Menace, Jar Jar performs physical feats that are, if you stop to actually look at them, far beyond what any ordinary being should be capable of. There's a moment early in the film where he executes a jump, a full spinning 20-foot leap into the water when escaping Naboo, that looks, at first glance, like slapstick. Clumsy landing, comedic reaction. But the jump itself is extraordinary. The kind of jump we've only ever seen Force users perform. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, standing nearby, both glance at him with what you could reasonably read as surprise. The theory, drawing on a real martial arts tradition, suggests that Jar Jar's entire physical style is a concealed form of Zui Quan, drunken fist wushu, in which a practitioner deliberately makes their movements appear uncontrolled and sloppy, using apparent chaos as both a distraction and a defensive technique. The idea is that every stumble, every pratfall, every moment of apparent buffoonery is completely intentional. The clumsiness is the cover. Then there's the Battle of Naboo, which is the most compelling part of the whole argument. Jar Jar is assigned to lead a Gungan army against a droid force, in what everyone acknowledges will be a catastrophic mismatch. He has no military training and no apparent tactical sense. And yet, over the course of the battle, every single thing that goes wrong for him somehow works out in the Republic's favour. A droid gets attached to his foot, and he accidentally activates it, realises it's shooting his enemies, and proceeds to hop around the battlefield using it as a weapon. And there's a moment, just a brief one, where he looks almost amused, not panicked, amused. It's a small thing, but it's there. The hand gestures are another piece of the puzzle. Throughout the prequels, whenever Jar Jar is trying to convince someone of something, he uses these elaborate hand movements, precisely the sort of gestures we associate with Jedi or Sith using subtle force influence on weak minds. Most obviously, the scene in Attack of the Clones where he's standing in the Senate and proposing that the Chancellor be granted emergency powers. Sweeping, deliberate hand motions, the motion that effectively hands Palpatine the keys to the Republic. Jar Jar was the one who did that. Not a coincidence, says the theory. A Sith carrying out a plan. There's also the question of his position. Jar Jar begins the prequels as a clumsy exile, banished from his own city for being a menace. By Attack of the Clones, he's a junior senator representing Naboo in the Galactic Senate, standing in for Padme in her absence. That's an enormous political rise for someone who can barely walk in a straight line. Unless, of course, there's something else going on. The Yoda parallel is worth sitting with for a moment. On Dagobah, Yoda famously pretends to be a ridiculous little creature, bumbling around Luke's campsite, eating his food, talking in slightly fractured sentences, as a deliberate test of Luke's patience and an assessment of his character. It's one of the most beloved misdirections in cinema. The theory argues that Jar Jar was meant to be the dark side version of that exact trick. Just as the greatest Jedi Master hid himself as a harmless fool, the hidden Sith would hide himself as an even more harmless one. Now, where does this theory actually stand? The consensus, even among its fans, is that it's almost certainly not true as canon. That whatever George Lucas may have originally intended, the character became what we see in the films, and that's the version that exists. Lucas has never confirmed it, though he did call Jar Jar the key to all of this in a behind-the-scenes interview, which fans have been analysing for years. What's genuinely interesting is what happened in 2025 when Marvel Comics published Star Wars: Jar Jar. The comic confirmed that Palpatine and Jar Jar had a secret understanding. Palpatine calls him my favourite delegate and extends him special favours. But rather than confirming Jar Jar as a Sith collaborator, the comic reframes the relationship. Palpatine kept Jar Jar close because he considered him a non-threat, which actually gave Jar Jar room to manoeuvre in ways that ultimately served the rebellion. So the theory got turned on its head. Jar Jar as an accidental rebel rather than a hidden Sith, which is, in its own way, a lovely resolution for a character people spent years making fun of. I've always found the Darth Jar Jar theory compelling, not because I think it's true, but because of what it says about how we read stories. The idea that the most overlooked, most dismissed character in the room might be the one who actually understands everything. That's a genuinely interesting narrative principle. Yoda weaponized it openly. Maybe the original plan was for someone to weaponize it from the other side. And if that plan existed and got abandoned, I think we're allowed to be a little wistful about the story we didn't get. But talking about Jar Jar inevitably leads back to Palpatine, to the Senate, to the emergency powers, to the question of just how far back his plan actually went. And that's its own rabbit hole, one that touches on some of the deepest and most fascinating lore in the entire saga. There's a scene in Revenge of the Sith, just a few minutes of runtime, that has generated more fan theory discussion than almost anything else in the entire franchise. Palpatine and Anakin are sitting at the opera, watching some alien performance in the dark, and Palpatine leans over and begins telling a story. The tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, he calls it. An ancient Sith Lord, he says, so powerful and so wise that he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life. He had such a knowledge of the dark side, he could even keep the ones he cared about from dying. Ironic, Palpatine finishes, that he could save others from death, but not himself. And then, in the silence that follows, "Did you ever hear this tragedy, Anakin?" "No, Palpatine, I thought not. It's not a story the Jedi would tell you." That scene, that delivery, Ian McDiarmid doing something truly remarkable with a very short amount of dialogue. It's become something of a cultural touchstone. The "Did you ever hear?" The tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise meme has been around since 2005 and shows absolutely no sign of going away. But underneath the meme, the lore is genuinely fascinating, and the theories that have built up around it are some of the most satisfying in Star Wars. Let's establish what we actually know canonically. Darth Plagueis was Palpatine's master, a Sith Lord so obsessed with cheating death that he spent his life experimenting with midi-chlorians, the microscopic organisms that live within all cells and mediate a being's connection to the Force. He apparently succeeded in learning to manipulate them in extraordinary ways, preventing death, possibly creating life. His apprentice, Darth Sidious, eventually killed him in his sleep. Classic rule of two, that's the canon. But there's considerably more in the Legends material, specifically in James Luceno's 2012 novel Darth Plagueis, which, though non-canon, established a framework that has influenced how fans think about the character ever since. In Luceno's telling, Plagueis was a moon, a tall, slender, pale-skinned species associated with banking and finance, and he conducted his experiments on a scale that would eventually have consequences far beyond his own life or death. Here's the theory that I find most compelling, and which has a certain amount of support in both the Legends material and some canonical sources. Plagueis and Sidious, working together, attempted to tip the Force itself toward the dark side, not just to accumulate personal power, but to fundamentally alter the balance of the galaxy, to make darkness the dominant principle. And the Force, according to this theory, treated that like an infection and responded accordingly. The midi-chlorians, acting as a kind of immune system for the Force, or as messengers of its will, created a being to correct the imbalance. A being born without a father, with a midi-chlorian count higher than any Jedi ever recorded. A child conceived by the Force itself as a countermeasure. Anakin Skywalker, in this reading, is the galaxy's immune response to Darth Plagueis. George Lucas confirmed, in an interview included in the book Star Wars Archives, Episodes Order 3, that Anakin was created by the will of the Force through the midi-chlorians, so that part is canon. Where it gets more interesting is the question of whether Plagueis' experiments were responsible for that, either intentionally or accidentally. Lucas also said in a different context that the legend of Plagueis' abilities was a lie. Palpatine was manipulating Anakin, telling him what he needed to hear. So there's genuine ambiguity built into the story itself, which is rather elegant. But then there's the other layer, the cutscene. In an early draft of Revenge of the Sith, there was a version of the opera scene in which Palpatine goes further. He doesn't just tell Anakin the story of Plagueis, he tells Anakin the truth about his own birth. "I arranged for your conception," Palpatine says in the draft. "I used the power of the Force to will the midi-chlorians to start the cell divisions that created you." The scene was written, filmed as a draft, and cut before the final film. Lucas decided to leave it ambiguous, but that ambiguity is doing a great deal of work. If Palpatine is telling the truth in that draft, if he genuinely orchestrated Anakin's creation, then he is, in the most literal sense, Anakin's father, which makes Darth Vader the son of Palpatine, and Ben Solo his great-grandson. And Rey Palpatine's granddaughter is also, in a very strange way, connected to Anakin through Palpatine's original act of creation. The saga becomes tighter and more disturbing and more complete all at once. There's also the Shmi theory, which I think deserves a mention here, because it's one of those ideas that got considerably more interesting as new canon arrived. Shmi Skywalker, Anakin's mother, is captured by Tusken Raiders after being freed from slavery on Tatooine. She's held captive for over a month, tortured, and dies in Anakin's arms. The event that triggers his massacre of the entire Tusken camp and marks a major step toward the dark side. The question the theory asks is, why? Tusken Raiders in the original films are presented as hostile but not gratuitous. The Book of Boba Fett later showed us Tusken culture as genuinely complex. They have traditions, rituals, a social structure. People with those things don't typically kidnap freed slaves for no reason and hold them for a month. The theory is that Palpatine arranged Shmi's capture, that he engineered the specific event that would push Anakin toward violence, toward anger, toward the dark side. It would require some form of manipulation or payment. Tusken Raiders aren't in Palpatine's payroll in any obvious sense, but Palpatine had demonstrated throughout his entire career that he could arrange events from an extraordinary distance without anyone connecting it back to him. It's circumstantial, but it fits his pattern completely. He needed Anakin to take his first steps toward darkness. Anakin's mother was the most effective lever available. What this all adds up to, the birth theory, the Shmi theory, the cut dialogue, is a picture of Palpatine as an architect of truly breathtaking scope. Not just a political manipulator, not just a powerful dark side user, but someone who may have been shaping events from before Anakin even existed. The man who killed his master, manipulated a republic, started a war, and possibly engineered the birth of the very person he would eventually turn into his enforcer. And he did it all while looking like a perfectly pleasant senator from a small planet. I find this genuinely staggering when I sit with it. The scale of patience involved, the decades of planning. It makes him one of the most effective villains in cinema, not because he's physically intimidating, he's a small elderly man in a robe, but because of the sheer scope of what he was doing the entire time. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. George Lucas had a plan for a sequel trilogy. He sold Lucasfilm to Disney in 2012, and Disney made their own sequels, and most people know the broad outline of what the Disney version looked like. But what Lucas was actually working on before the sale, the direction he'd been moving in, the ideas he'd been developing, is genuinely fascinating, and it's quite different from what we got. The centerpiece of Lucas's planned sequels was something called the microbiotic world, specifically a deeper exploration of beings called the Wills. The Wills are one of the oldest concepts in Star Wars. They appear in Lucas's very first document about the universe, a 1973 treatment titled The Journal of the Wills. In that earliest version, the Wills were meant to be the beings who recorded the events of the saga. The whole story was framed as being written down in a journal, told to a keeper of the Wills by R2-D2, who had witnessed everything. That's a lovely idea, actually. R2 as the saga's true narrator, an astromech droid telling the story of the Skywalker family to ancient cosmic observers. That framing didn't make it into the films, but the Wills never entirely went away. In Revenge of the Sith, there's a deleted scene in which Qui-Gon Jinn's voice reaches out to Yoda. Just a voice at this stage, because Qui-Gon had died before completing his training in Force immortality, and mentions learning this technique from a shaman of the Wills. That scene was cut, though the idea survived in other forms. By the time Lucas was working on his sequel outlines, before selling the company, the Wills had evolved considerably. In a conversation with director James Cameron for a documentary called The Story of Science Fiction, Lucas described what his sequels would have been about: a microbiotic world. beings called the wills, he explained, who exist at the cellular level. Tiny, godlike entities who feed off the Force, and in his vision, actually control the universe. The midi-chlorians, Lucas said, are the conduits through which the wills connect to living beings. The midi-chlorians don't generate the Force, they're messengers. They communicate the will of the wills, which is a genuinely extraordinary idea when you sit with it. It means that at the deepest level of the Star Wars universe, underneath all the Jedi and Sith and politics and lightsabers, there are microscopic beings who are essentially running everything. The Force isn't just an energy field, it's the medium through which these ancient, incomprehensible entities exert their influence. And the wills are the Force. Lucas himself said that in almost those words. The midi-chlorians are the ones that communicate with the wills. The wills, in a general sense, they are the Force. This is the part that makes me genuinely melancholy about the sequel trilogy we didn't get. Not because the sequels we did get are without merit. There are things I love in all three of them. But because the idea of a trilogy that took Star Wars to that level of cosmic philosophy is something I'd have dearly liked to see. A story about human beings discovering that the universe is run by tiny beings who have been there since before any civilization existed. That's not a small idea. The wills did make it into canon in quieter ways. In Rogue One, two of the most beloved characters, Chirrut Imwe and Baz Malbus, are described as guardians of the wills, members of a Force-worshipping monastic order based on the moon Jedha. Their temple is called the Temple of the Wills. Chirrut, who is blind, navigates by pure faith. I am one with the Force and the Force is with me, in a way that suggests a genuinely personal relationship with something most Jedi treat as a tool. There's something lovely about that. The Guardians of the Wills aren't Jedi. They have no special training. They just believe completely. And somehow that belief makes Chirrut bulletproof through an entire combat sequence. The Force or the wills, or whatever they actually are, seems to respond to that. The Shaman of the Wills also appears in the Clone Wars, in a more abstract form. The Force priestesses who guide Yoda through his spiritual journey in the final arc of the series are beings of a similar type, ancient, metaphysical, beyond ordinary understanding. They're the ones who complete Qui-Gon's unfinished teaching and allow Yoda to learn how to persist as a consciousness after death. And that's the other interesting thing about the wills concept. It raises questions about free will that the films never quite address. If the wills are microscopic entities who control the universe and offer destinies to the beings who inhabit it, if the midi-chlorians are their messengers and the Force is their medium, then how much of what happens in Star Wars is choice and how much is script? When Qui-Gon found Anakin on Tatooine, was that luck? Or was it the wills placing the right person in the right position at the right time? When Anakin said yes to Palpatine, was that a free decision made by a frightened young man? Or was it the culmination of something the wills had been orchestrating for decades? I don't think Lucas had fully resolved that tension. I'm not sure it needs resolving. But it's the kind of question that makes the mythology feel genuinely deep rather than decorative. There's a reason that fans who discovered this aspect of the lore tend to find the prequels more interesting on a second or third watch. The wills are, as Lucas always said, the Force itself, and the Force has always been doing something more than providing convenient superpowers for the protagonists. What I find most affecting about the whole wills concept is how it connects to the most intimate moments in the saga. When Obi-Wan tells Luke that a Jedi becomes part of the Force at death, when Yoda, dying, simply smiles and says, "Strong am I with the Force, but not that strong." There's a serenity there that isn't just about accepting death. It's about returning to something, becoming part of the great network of beings who are, and have always been, the actual fabric of the universe. That's quite a thing to be carrying around inside a space opera about laser swords. When Obi-Wan Kenobi steps into Darth Vader's lightsaber on the Death Star in A New Hope, something strange happens. His cloak drops to the floor. His body is gone, and Vader stares at the empty cloth with what looks genuinely like confusion. He nudges it with his foot. There's nothing there. Now consider that Darth Vader fought in the Clone Wars. He killed Jedi personally. He was present when Order 66 was executed and the Jedi were hunted down. He has, by this point in his life, caused the deaths of an enormous number of Force users. And yet he seems genuinely surprised by what he's just seen. Obi-Wan's disappearance at the moment of death isn't something he recognizes. Doesn't seem like something he's seen before, which means that whatever Obi-Wan did, whatever allowed him to vanish and then reappear later as a glowing blue presence who talks to Luke, it's not something the Jedi Order did routinely. It's new, or rather, it's very old knowledge that had been almost entirely lost and was only recently rediscovered. This is one of those areas where the canon, particularly the Clone Wars, does something genuinely wonderful. The ability to become a Force spirit, to retain your individual consciousness after death rather than dissolving into the Force as most beings do, isn't a standard Jedi skill. It requires specific training from a specific source. And the first person to discover how to do it, at least in the modern era of the Jedi Order, was Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon, as any prequel fan knows, was a bit of an outsider within the Jedi Order. He followed the living Force rather than the cosmic Force, meaning he cared about the present, about the living beings in front of him, rather than the grand patterns and prophecies the Council was always attending to. He refused to let the Council tell him what to do when he disagreed with them. He had a relationship with Anakin that went against the Council's wishes. He was, broadly, not a team player. And at some point before the events of The Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon encountered a shaman of the Wills, one of those ancient beings who served the Great Network we were discussing in the last section, and began learning something the Jedi Order didn't know: how to survive death, how to retain individuality after becoming one with the Force. He didn't complete the training before Darth Maul killed him on Naboo. That's the tragedy of it. He got there first, he understood the principle, and then he was gone before he could bring the knowledge fully back to the Order. What he was able to do, from wherever consciousness goes after death, was continue learning, and eventually contact both Yoda and Obi-Wan. In the final arc of the Clone Wars, there's an extraordinary sequence in which Yoda embarks on a spiritual journey that takes him to Dagobah, to the planet Moraband, the ancient Sith homeworld, and eventually to the birthplace of the midi-chlorians themselves, where he encounters the Force priestesses. These beings are the ones who complete Qui-Gon's unfinished teaching. They show Yoda what selflessness, true selflessness, actually means in this context. Because the ability to retain consciousness after death requires giving up all attachment to self, all ego, all clinging. You have to be willing to dissolve entirely in order to persist at all, which is a rather beautiful paradox. Obi-Wan then learns the technique during his years of exile on Tatooine, and this is where the timeline gets interesting. By the time we reach A New Hope, there are 3 Jedi who know how to do this: Qui-Gon, who discovered it, Yoda, who learned it from the priestesses, and Obi-Wan, who learned it from Yoda and Qui-Gon. That's the complete lineage of Force immortality, 3 people in the entire Jedi Order, at the end. Now what about Anakin? Anakin Skywalker, who appears at the end of Return of the Jedi as a young, smiling Force spirit standing alongside Obi-Wan and Yoda, never received this training. He was cut off from the Jedi by his turn to the dark side long before he could have learned it. So how is he there? The theory, and I find this one quite moving, is that Anakin didn't learn Force immortality through training. He earned it through sacrifice. The Force itself responding to the act of redemption and the choice he made in throwing Palpatine into the reactor shaft granted him what the training would have given him. It was a gift, essentially. The Force recognizing that the Chosen One had finally done the thing he was created to do and allowing him to remain rather than dissolve. There's another layer here which involves the dark side's own relationship with immortality. The Sith, throughout the saga, have been obsessed with cheating death. That's half of Plagueis' whole deal, and it's the promise Palpatine dangled in front of Anakin. But the Sith technique for surviving death is fundamentally different from what the Jedi discovered. The Sith approach involves clinging, possessing, transferring essence into other vessels. It's exactly what Palpatine eventually did, possessing cloned bodies, essentially haunting the galaxy rather than transcending it. It's survival through refusal to let go, which requires the opposite of what Force Ghost training requires. What the Jedi discovered, in other words, is the one form of immortality that the Sith's entire philosophy makes them incapable of achieving. You can only persist as yourself if you're willing to let go of yourself completely. The Sith, by definition, never get there. I think about that sometimes when I'm watching the original trilogy. Obi-Wan, Yoda, and eventually Anakin standing together in peaceful blue light. 3 people who understood something that the most powerful Sith in history never figured out. Not because they were more powerful, but because they were more willing to let go. That's a rather lovely thing for a film to have built into it so quietly. But the Chosen One prophecy is one of those things that sounds clear when you first hear it and becomes progressively less clear the more you think about it. In The Phantom Menace, the Jedi Council examines Anakin Skywalker and discovers that his midi-chlorian count is higher than any Jedi ever recorded, higher even than Master Yoda. Qui-Gon Jinn believes he may be the being spoken of in an ancient prophecy, one who will bring balance to the Force. The Council is dubious, partly because Anakin is old for a Jedi initiate, and partly because they sense fear in him, which they correctly identify as a problem. But the prophecy is taken seriously enough that it influences their decision to train him. What the prophecy doesn't specify is what balance actually means. The Jedi assume, reasonably enough from their perspective, that balance means the light side's victory. There are thousands of Jedi and 2 Sith. Eliminating the Sith and restoring peace to the galaxy seems like the obvious definition of balance, so they expect the Chosen One to make things better, to strengthen what already exists. But here's the uncomfortable maths. At the peak of the Jedi Order, there are roughly 10,000 Jedi. There are 2 Sith operating in secret. By the end of Revenge of the Sith, there are 2 Jedi, Yoda and Obi-Wan, in hiding, and 2 Sith, Palpatine and Vader. By the end of Return of the Jedi, there's 1 Jedi, Luke, and no Sith. Does that count as balance? The light side won technically. But if balance literally means parity between light and dark, then Anakin achieved something closer to that at the end of the prequels than the galaxy had in centuries, which is a rather alarming interpretation. George Lucas addressed this directly, actually. He said that balance meant the elimination of the Sith, full stop, that the Jedi represented the natural state of the Force, and the Sith were a corruption that needed removing. In his reading, Anakin did fulfill the prophecy. He destroyed the Sith by killing Palpatine, albeit at the very end of his life, and not in the way anyone expected. But there's a theory, and it's the one I find most interesting, which says that the Jedi's understanding of the prophecy was itself part of the problem, that the Jedi Order, at the height of its power, had become something the Force needed to correct and preserve. Not because the Jedi were villains, but because they had become rigid, hierarchical, politically entangled in the Republic they were supposed to serve impartially, and emotionally repressive in ways that caused tremendous psychological damage to their members, including, specifically, Anakin. Count Dooku says something in Attack of the Clones that no one really listens to because he's the bad guy. The dark side of the Force has clouded their vision. He's talking about the Jedi Council, and while Dooku is certainly not a reliable narrator, he's also not entirely wrong. The Jedi couldn't sense the Sith Lord sitting in the Chancellor's chair. They were blind to the thing directly in front of them for years. Their judgment had failed at an enormous scale. The Mortis arc in the Clone Wars Season 3 does something fascinating with all of this. Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka encounter a world, or perhaps a dimension, called Mortis, which appears to be a vergence in the Force of extraordinary power. There they meet three beings: a father, a son, and a daughter, who represent the balance of the Force between light and dark. The father has held the son, darkness, and daughter, light, in equilibrium for an age. When the father dies, the balance is lost. The son becomes monstrous. The daughter sacrifices herself. What the Mortis arc seems to be saying, and it's genuinely strange and dreamlike enough that seems to be saying is about as precise as I can get, is that balance isn't the victory of one side over another. It's the maintenance of a dynamic tension between them. The father isn't trying to eliminate darkness. He's containing it, negotiating with it, preventing it from overrunning the light. And Anakin in that arc is specifically identified as the one who could hold this balance. Not because he's purely good, but precisely because he carries both light and dark within him simultaneously. He's the one person who can stand in the middle. There's also a version of the theory that says Luke, not Anakin, is the actual chosen one, or that the prophecy referred to the Skywalker lineage as a unit rather than a single individual. Anakin brought the Sith down from inside. Luke restored the Jedi. Together, perhaps, they fulfilled what the prophecy intended in a way that either of them alone couldn't have. I lean toward the interpretation that Anakin did fulfill the prophecy, but that the Jedi's reading of what it meant was simply wrong, shaped by their own assumptions about their own importance. They expected a hero who would save the Order. What they got was something more like a controlled demolition, the destruction of both the Sith and the corrupt version of the Jedi Order, clearing the ground for something smaller and truer to rebuild from. Luke eventually, building a new Jedi Order out of almost nothing, perhaps represents what the Force was actually aiming for all along. Not a military institution with 10,000 members and political influence across the galaxy. Just a person or a few people who understand the Force and use it with humility. Whether that was worth all the death and suffering involved is a different question. One the films don't really answer, and probably can't. Attack of the Clones introduced one of the most intriguing unresolved mysteries in the Star Wars canon, and then, rather quietly, left it mostly unresolved. The mystery of Sifo-Dyas. When Obi-Wan Kenobi travels to the ocean planet Kamino, following a bounty hunter's trail, he discovers an extraordinary thing. A secret army of clone troopers, a force of millions created over the course of 10 years to serve the Galactic Republic. The Kaminoans believe this was commissioned by a Jedi Master named Sifo-Dyas, who apparently came to them roughly a decade earlier and placed the Order privately, without the Council's knowledge, believing that the Republic would soon need an army. When Obi-Wan brings this back to the Council, they're confused. Obi-Wan says he doesn't recognize the name. Mace Windu says Sifo-Dyas was a Jedi who was killed over a decade ago, before the Order would have been placed. Yoda confirms they haven't been in contact with the Kaminoans. The army exists, has been growing for years, and nobody in the Jedi Order knows who actually ordered it. Revenge of the Sith and subsequent canon material eventually explained it, after a fashion. Sifo-Dyas was a real Jedi who had visions of a coming war and went to Kamino on his own initiative, and Dooku later arranged his death and worked with Palpatine to take control of the army through a Sith proxy. The explanation is serviceable. It fills the plot hole. But it's also, honestly, a bit flat. The fan theory that I find much more satisfying, and which has circulated since well before the Clone Wars animated series got around to addressing it, is that Sifo-Dyas was Qui-Gon Jinn. The reasoning runs like this. Qui-Gon was a Jedi who operated outside the Council's authority when he believed it was right to do so. He was deeply attuned to the living Force, which means he was sensitive to immediate, present events, exactly the kind of sensitivity that might produce a genuine premonition about an impending war. He had a close relationship with Count Dooku, his former master, which could explain how Dooku was involved in the aftermath of the commission. He died around the same time the order was placed. The timelines are at least compatible, and Sifo Dyas is, to this day, a name that sounds artificial, like a constructed identity rather than something anyone would be actually named at birth. Most compellingly, if Qui-Gon had secretly commissioned the clone army under an assumed name, it would mean that his lineage, Dooku, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, Anakin, was directly connected to both sides of the war that followed. Dooku led the Separatists, Anakin fought for the Republic, with an army that Qui-Gon maybe created. The circle would be genuinely elegant. The Clone Wars series gave us a more prosaic explanation and confirmed that Sifo Dyas and Qui-Gon were different people. But it left enough gaps that the original theory still has advocates. And I think it says something interesting that the fan version continued to circulate even after canon contradicted it. Sometimes a theory is better than its replacement. What interests me more, sitting with the whole clone army situation, is what it says about the Jedi Order's relationship with the war. At some point, roughly midway through the conflict, the Jedi stopped being peacekeepers and became generals. They were running military operations, commanding battalions, directing the deaths of millions of clones. The Jedi Code emphasized peace, compassion, the absence of attachment. None of that survives contact with the strategic realities of galactic warfare. And the clones they were commanding had been created specifically to execute Order 66. They were always the executioners, built with that purpose, baked into their biology, and the Jedi never knew. There's a particular sadness to that. Thousands of Jedi spent 3 years building personal relationships with the soldiers under their command, going through extraordinary hardship together, and those soldiers were, from the beginning, designed to kill them. The Jedi were used. They couldn't see it. And the reason they couldn't, that certainty we talked about in the Chosen One section, that institutional confidence that had calcified over centuries, is exactly what made them vulnerable to someone patient enough to use it against them. At the end of Revenge of the Sith, there's a brief scene that, if you blink, you might miss. C-3PO and R2-D2 are in the care of Bail Organa. Bail turns to one of his officers and says something to the effect that C-3PO's memory should be wiped. The deed is done. C-3PO will go into the original trilogy with no memory of the events of the prequels. He'll meet Obi-Wan Kenobi as a stranger, encounter Luke Skywalker without knowing who he is, and carry none of the context that would make the tragedy of the galaxy legible to him. R2-D2 is not wiped. This is confirmed. It's explicit in the film, and it's never retconned. R2 goes into the original trilogy with complete memory intact. He remembers everything. Think about what that means. R2-D2 knows that Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker. He was there on Naboo when Anakin and Padme fell in love. He was with Anakin through the Clone Wars, through the worst moments, through the marriage, through the pregnancy. He was present for or aware of most of the major events leading up to Order 66. He watched the Republic fall and the Empire rise, and then he spent the next 19 years as an astromech droid aboard various ships, ostensibly helpless, saying nothing. In A New Hope, R2-D2 is carrying a message from Princess Leia to Obi-Wan Kenobi. When he lands on Tatooine, he immediately sets off into the desert, specifically to find Obi-Wan. He leads Luke directly to him. Obi-Wan, when introduced to R2, says he doesn't remember owning a droid. But R2 remembers Obi-Wan perfectly. He knows exactly who he is. He knows where to go, he knows whom to find, and he knows what the mission is. And because from R2's perspective, this isn't a new story. This is the continuation of one he's been part of for decades. When Obi-Wan says he doesn't remember the droid, R2 says nothing. C-3PO translates nothing remarkable. But you can read that scene quite differently if you consider what R2 is choosing not to say. The theory that R2-D2 has been the saga's primary witness, the one continuous observer across all 9 films, and most of the animated material is one of those ideas that improves everything it touches. Every scene with R2 in the original trilogy takes on a new quality if you assume he understands the full context of what's happening. His apparent excitement when he finds Obi-Wan isn't just a droid on a mission. His apparent distress when things go wrong isn't just programming. His moments of what looks like personality, the beeping that always sounds more expressive than a series of electronic tones should, might be the reactions of a small being who has seen too much and is watching it all happen again. There's actually a creative history here that supports this reading. George Lucas, in the earliest development of A New Hope, intended for R2-D2 to narrate the saga to a keeper of the Wills. The story was framed as being recorded in the Journal of the Wills, as told by R2. That framing didn't survive into the final film, but the role it implies, R2 as the story's true witness and narrator, is built into the character's DNA. He was always meant to be the one who knows. The counter-argument is simple. If R2 knows all of this, why doesn't he say anything useful? Why doesn't he tell Luke at some point that Vader is his father? Why doesn't he tell Leia that she's Luke's twin sister? Why does he sit on this extraordinary store of information and apparently do nothing with it? A few possible answers. 1. R2 is a droid, and the organic beings around him have, for the most part, stopped listening to droids as sources of meaningful information. He communicates in beeps and whistles that require translation. When he has something important to say, he often does say it. He just has to work within the constraints of how much anyone is willing to listen to an astromech. 2. R2 may have understood at some level that certain revelations needed to come at certain times. He didn't tell Luke about Vader because Luke wasn't ready. The Force, the Wills, whatever we're calling the intelligent substrate of the universe, was guiding events. And R2, more attuned to that guidance than most, may have known that patience was required. 3, and this is the reading I like best, R2 trusted the people around him to find their own way. He watched Obi-Wan, Yoda, and eventually Luke work through things in their own time. He helped where he could, in ways that were sometimes crucial, and otherwise waited. He'd already seen one attempt at forcing destiny, and it had gone catastrophically wrong. Maybe he'd learned something from that. There's something quietly wonderful about the idea that the most important witness to the entire Skywalker saga is a small blue and white droid who communicates in electronic sounds and has never, in 9 films, been asked the right questions. Owen Lars in the original trilogy is a moisture farmer on Tatooine. That's more or less his entire character. He appears in a handful of scenes in A New Hope, is firmly opposed to Luke doing anything with his life, except continuing to operate moisture evaporators, and dies burned alongside his wife Beru before the film has reached its first act. He's easy to dismiss. He's the obstacle in narrative terms. He's the person standing between Luke and his destiny. Gruff, practical, unlucky. But spend a bit of time with the backstory, and Owen Lars becomes one of the more quietly tragic figures in the whole saga. Owen met Anakin Skywalker in Attack of the Clones. Anakin arrived at the Lars homestead looking for his mother, found out she'd been taken by Tusken Raiders, went to rescue her, and returned carrying her body. Owen witnessed Anakin in grief, in rage, in the aftermath of what he'd just done to the Tusken camp, which Anakin confessed to, standing in that homestead, saying he killed them all. Not just the men, but the women and the children. Owen saw that. Owen then went to his own wedding, while across the galaxy, the Battle of Geonosis started the Clone Wars, and watched Anakin and Padme leave together, and presumably heard various things about what happened next as the war unfolded over 3 years. And then, at the end of Revenge of the Sith, Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived at the Lars homestead with an infant, a child named Luke, the son of Anakin Skywalker, who had recently become Darth Vader, who was now the Emperor's enforcer and one of the most feared beings in the galaxy. Owen took the child, he raised him, and he spent the next 19 years refusing to tell Luke anything. Now there's a reading of Owen that's purely protective. He was a decent man who loved the child he raised and was terrified of what would happen if the Empire found out who Luke was. That's entirely credible. It's probably the primary reading. But the theory worth sitting with is that Owen's resistance to Luke's Jedi ambitions wasn't just fear of the Empire. It was something more personal. It was fear of what Luke might become. Owen had seen Anakin. He'd seen what Force sensitivity and Jedi training and a particular emotional vulnerability could produce in a person. He'd watched Padme, intelligent, capable, deeply principled, die because of her connection to that world. He didn't want that for Luke. He wanted Luke to be a farmer, not because farming was the limit of Owen's imagination, but because farming was safe. Farming was life, not destruction. The Disney Plus series Obi-Wan Kenobi engaged with this directly, showing Owen and Obi-Wan in a genuinely antagonistic relationship. Owen doesn't want Obi-Wan near Luke. He doesn't want Luke trained. He tells Obi-Wan at one point to leave them alone. His attitude toward Obi-Wan isn't just caution, it reads more like blame, as if he holds Obi-Wan at least partly responsible for what happened to Anakin and wants no part of the same process repeating itself in his nephew. There's a line in A New Hope that I've always found striking when Beru and Owen are discussing Luke's restlessness. Beru says Luke has too much of his father in him. Owen's response, quiet and final, is, "That's what I'm afraid of." If Owen knew what Anakin had become, and it's hard to imagine he didn't, given that Darth Vader was publicly the Emperor's enforcer and presumably a known name across the galaxy, that line hits very differently. He's not afraid of Luke being reckless. He's afraid of a specific destination. He's afraid of the path that starts with a Force-sensitive young man from Tatooine who's told he's special and ends somewhere he's already seen. Whether Owen's approach was the right one is genuinely debatable. He kept Luke safe. He did that. Luke was a healthy, if frustrated young adult when A New Hope begins, with people who loved him, and a life that, if not exciting, was at least whole. What he didn't give Luke was truth. And truth, as we know, has a way of arriving eventually, on its own terms, whether you've prepared someone for it or not. Here's something worth remembering about the Sith. The rule of two isn't just a tradition. It's not a polite custom that Sith lords observe, out of habit or respect for history. It's the operating system. Darth Bane, roughly 1,000 years before the events of the Skywalker saga, witnessed the Sith nearly destroy themselves through their own compulsive backstabbing. There were too many Sith, all competing for power, all trying to kill each other rather than their enemies. Bane's solution was elegantly brutal, reduced to two: one master, one apprentice. The apprentice's job, ultimately, is to become strong enough to kill the master. The master's job is to train the apprentice while remaining more powerful than them for as long as possible. The fundamental tension of every Sith relationship, built into the rules. What this means is that Darth Vader plotting to overthrow Palpatine isn't treachery. It's not a corruption of his role. It's the literal definition of his role. Every Sith apprentice is supposed to be working toward killing their master. The only question is timing and capability. Look at the original trilogy through this lens, and the pattern becomes obvious. In The Empire Strikes Back, Vader offers Luke a partnership. Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son. He's not being sentimental, or not only sentimental, he's proposing a specific political and strategic arrangement. The two of them together against Palpatine. In Return of the Jedi, Vader is attempting the same thing through Palpatine's own scheme, bringing Luke before the Emperor in a situation where Luke might kill Palpatine, and then presumably face Vader as the new Sith Master. The rule of two in action, across both films. And when Luke refuses, when the trap doesn't spring the way anyone planned, Vader ends up making a different calculation. He watches Palpatine torturing Luke, his son, and something that had been dormant for 20 years reasserts itself. He throws Palpatine into the reactor shaft. He dies doing it, but he's achieved the same end. The Sith Master is dead. The theory that Vader was always working toward this, that his compliance was strategic rather than genuine, and that the Sith rule of succession was functioning the whole time, makes his arc in the original trilogy considerably more complex. He's not simply a tragic villain waiting for redemption. He's also a Sith operating exactly as Sith are designed to operate, biding his time, looking for the right lever, and eventually finding it in the form of his own child. The interesting question is whether Anakin and Vader are really separable at all, or whether the man who threw Palpatine into the shaft was making a personal choice that had nothing to do with Sith doctrine. There's a moment in the Darth Vader comics, canon published by Marvel, where Vader discovers that the pilot who destroyed the Death Star is named Skywalker. He figures out, from that name alone, that Luke is his son. And then he sits with that knowledge, alone, for years, while it quietly changes what he's calculating. There's another theory about Vader's final scene, about removing the helmet, that I find genuinely interesting. The most common reading is that Anakin wants to see his son with his own eyes before he dies, one last act of paternal love before the end. But there's a version of the theory that says Vader removed the helmet knowing it would kill him, as a deliberate choice, not because he was already dying from Palpatine's lightning. The timeline is ambiguous enough to support either reading, but because he was afraid that if he survived, if the life support kept him going, he might eventually slip back. Anakin Skywalker's track record of holding on to good decisions under pressure was not historically excellent. Removing the helmet in this reading is a lock on the door. He's making the choice irreversible while he still has the strength to make it. I don't know which version I believe, possibly both simultaneously. Anakin was always someone who operated on multiple levels at once. The devoted Jedi and the frightened boy, the loving husband and the man capable of terrible violence, the loyal servant and the Sith plotting succession. A character who contains that much contradiction is probably capable of removing a helmet for more than one reason at the same time. What I find most interesting about all of this is how the rule of two, a doctrine built on betrayal and murder, became the mechanism through which the Sith ultimately ended themselves. Palpatine trained Vader. Vader eventually killed Palpatine. The rules worked exactly as designed. The only variable Palpatine didn't account for was love, a factor that Sith doctrine explicitly eliminates, or tries to, which is rather elegant in a tragic sort of way. Snoke is introduced in The Force Awakens as a genuinely imposing presence. He's vast, or appears to be as a hologram, with a heavily disfigured face, robes of gold, a manner that suggests great age and greater power, and a relationship with Kylo Ren that feels complicated in ways the film doesn't have time to fully explore. He refers to the dark side, to the balance of the Force, in ways that suggest deep familiarity with concepts that most people in the sequel trilogy era barely understand. He says at one point that he watched the rise of the Empire, the fall of the Empire, and the rise of the First Order, which would make him extraordinarily old. 2 films later, Kylo Ren kills him. And then the rise of Skywalker reveals that Snoke was essentially a puppet created by Palpatine, a vessel for the Emperor's influence, made, as Palpatine puts it, never truly independent. The mystery's resolved, the powerful figure deflated, the story moves on. A significant portion of the fandom found this unsatisfying, and I think that's understandable. Not because the explanation is incoherent, it actually opens up an interesting concept. The idea of Palpatine as a manipulator, so thorough he created a false dark side leader to run things, while keeping his own survival secret. But because 2 films of build-up suggested something more. The theory that has always fascinated me is the Darth Plagueis theory. The idea that Snoke is Plagueis, surviving his own murder through the very techniques he spent his life developing. Think about what we know of Plagueis. He mastered midi-chlorian manipulation to an extraordinary degree. He was obsessed with cheating death. His apprentice killed him in his sleep, in a physical sense. But if Plagueis had genuinely learned to transfer his consciousness, to persist in some form beyond the death of his body, then killed might be an incomplete description of what happened. He might have retreated wounded and diminished, and spent years recovering in secret while Palpatine ran the Empire he'd helped build. The physical case for Snoke as Plagueis is circumstantial but interesting. Plagueis was canonically a moon, a tall, pale, slender humanoid species associated with banking and finance in the Star Wars universe. Snoke, in his physical form, is tall, pale and elongated. His scarring could be the result of whatever happened when Palpatine killed him, or the cost of decades of dark side experimentation and essence transfer. His extreme age, his depth of knowledge, his specific interest in the Skywalker bloodline, Plagueis was there at the beginning of the Skywalker story, in the theory that his experiments created Anakin. All of it fits. What the Snoke as Plagueis theory would have given the sequel trilogy is something it genuinely lacks: continuity of antagonism. The prequels are essentially the story of Plagueis' plan coming to fruition through Palpatine. The sequels in this reading would be the story of Plagueis himself finishing what he started, the Force's greatest enemy, having survived everything thrown at him, returning to claim what was always supposed to be his. That's a complete saga. 3 trilogies, 1 villain threading through all of them. That's not what we got, and I've made my peace with it. But I remain fond of the theory. The other version of the Snoke mystery that circulates is simpler and darker. That Snoke was always a puppet, always a creation, and that the horror of his existence is precisely that. He was conscious, apparently. He had thoughts, preferences, a relationship with Kylo Ren that involved something like genuine contempt and something like genuine pride. And all of that consciousness was manufactured. He was a person, more or less, who had no origin outside of Palpatine's laboratory. What does that mean for personhood? What does it mean for the question of whether Snoke was evil? Can a being be held responsible for actions taken in service of the person who literally created them? The rise of Skywalker novelization adds a detail that's easy to miss: Palpatine's expression when he says, "Snoke was made," his eyes lighting up, a flash of something that looks like pleasure. He's proud. He built something that worked, which is unsettling in a way that the film itself doesn't fully develop. I suppose what I find most interesting about the Snoke conversation is what it reveals about the sequel trilogy's relationship with mystery. The Force Awakens was built around deliberate, unanswered questions. Who is Snoke? Who are Rey's parents? What happened to Luke? Those questions generated enormous fan engagement, an enormous amount of theory crafting, a genuine sense of a mystery unfolding. When the answers arrived, they were sometimes smaller than the questions, which is, in fairness, often how mysteries work. The anticipation outgrows any possible resolution. That doesn't make the questions less interesting to revisit. If anything, it makes them more interesting, because the gap between what we imagined and what we got is where fan theories live most comfortably. There's a ritual in Star Wars lore called the Gathering. It takes place on the ice planet Elam, which longtime fans will recognise as later becoming the Starkiller base of the First Order, which is either a neat piece of circular storytelling or a bit of a waste of a meaningful location, depending on your perspective. During the Gathering, Jedi younglings travel to Ilum and enter a crystal cave. Each child must find their own Kyber crystal, the stone that will eventually power their lightsaber. And each crystal, the canon establishes clearly, is different for each person. The crystal doesn't just sit there waiting to be found. It has to choose you as much as you choose it. You navigate the cave through a vision of your own fears and character, and the crystal that resonates with you is specific to who you are. That's a lovely concept, but it implies something significant. Kyber crystals are, in some meaningful sense, alive, not conscious in the way a person is conscious, but attuned, responsive to the Force, capable of something like preference, capable of something like relationship. A kyber crystal bonded to a Jedi is not a passive object. It's an ongoing connection, which makes what happens to Sith lightsabers quite remarkable. In the Marvel Darth Vader comics, published in 2017, fully canonical, we see Vader construct his red lightsaber immediately after the events of Revenge of the Sith. He doesn't find a red crystal. Red kyber crystals don't occur naturally. Instead, Vader takes a kyber crystal from a Jedi he has killed and subjects it to a process that has come to be called bleeding. He pours his pain, his grief, his rage, his darkness into the crystal through the Force. The crystal resists. In the comic, this resistance is depicted almost like a fight. The crystal generating visions, trying to overwhelm Vader with memories of everyone he's lost, attempting to reach the part of him that might still turn back. He wins the fight. The crystal bleeds, turns red, crack-like fractures appearing across its surface, and the resulting lightsaber is his. What this means is that every Sith weapon in Star Wars is a broken thing. Not metaphorically broken, literally. A kyber crystal in a state of trauma, forced against its nature into service of the dark side. The red colour isn't an aesthetic choice made by dark side users. It's the colour of suffering. Every time a Sith ignites their lightsaber, they're wielding something that is, in its own strange way, screaming. I find that an extraordinarily affecting piece of lore. It gives the visual language of the films an additional layer that you can't unsee once you know it. Every red blade is a violated crystal. Every blue or green blade is a crystal in its natural state, in relationship with someone it chose. And then there's the Death Star. The Death Star's primary weapon, the super laser capable of destroying a planet, is powered by kyber crystals. This is confirmed in Rogue One era material, specifically in the novel Catalyst by James Luceno, which tells the story of the Death Star's development. Director Krennic and Galen Erso spent years figuring out how to harness kyber crystals at sufficient scale to generate that kind of destructive power. The crystal required isn't one crystal. It's an enormous focusing array of multiple crystals, of a scale the Empire spent years acquiring through violent means, stripping Jedi's minds, harvesting from Jedi sources wherever they could be found. The Death Star didn't just destroy Alderaan. It did so using sacred, living stones that the Jedi considered part of the Force itself, forced into a role that was the precise opposite of what they were meant for. Kyber crystals exist in the natural order of things to connect living beings to the Force. They were used on the largest possible scale to sever life from existence entirely. The fan theory that emerges from all of this, and I think it has a certain poetic credibility, is that the Death Star's famous thermal exhaust port, the 2-meter-wide structural weakness that allows Luke to destroy the station with a single torpedo, might not be a pure engineering oversight. A weapon powered by an enormous array of corrupted, traumatized crystals that were fighting against their own corruption, as we know single crystals can do, might have structural instabilities built into it by the Force itself. The crystals, at some level, introducing a flaw into the weapon that was using them. The film never says this. It's probably not intentional in the storytelling, but I appreciate the reading that the Death Star was brought down by the same Force it was trying to obliterate, working through the stones at its own heart. There's something satisfying about the idea that even in the darkest possible application of kyber technology, the crystals were still trying to do what they were made for. This is the section where we slow down even further and wander through some of the smaller theories, the ones that don't upend the saga but add texture to it. The kind of theories you mention in conversation and watch people's expressions change as they start reconsidering scenes they've watched 100 times. Let's start with Han Solo and the Kessel Run. In A New Hope, Han Solo is trying to impress Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker with the Millennium Falcon's credentials. He tells them the Falcon made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs, and immediately, if you're paying any attention, something seems off. A parsec is a unit of distance, not time. 12 parsecs is about 39 light years. Boasting that your ship completed a route in less than a certain distance doesn't mean anything unless the route is variable. Unless there's a standard path and a shorter, more dangerous one that your superior ship can handle because of its speed or maneuverability. The fan interpretation, which existed from 1977 onward, was always that Han was boasting about a shortcut. The Kessel Run has a standard safe route. The Falcon can take a shorter path that other ships can't survive. That's what 12 parsecs means. He did it faster than anyone else by being willing to fly a more dangerous line. The 1976 draft of A New Hope is interesting here. There are stage directions for Obi-Wan's reaction to Han's claim that read as him responding to Solo's stupid attempt to impress them with obvious misinformation. Alec Guinness plays the scene that way. You can see him quietly unimpressed, not believing what Han is saying. In this older reading, Han was lying and Obi-Wan knew it. Just a man in a bar making things up to close a deal. The Solo film eventually confirmed the distance interpretation with actual plot. The Kessel Run involves flying near a gravitational phenomenon called the Maw, and Lando's record before Han was 14 parsecs. Han gets it down to 12 by cutting closer to the Maw than anyone had before. It's a creative choice that resolves the apparent error neatly. But I have a soft spot for the original version, where Han might just have been talking nonsense, and Obi-Wan clocked it immediately and hired him anyway. Now to the Lars homestead. In A New Hope, Luke returns home to find the moisture farm burning and Owen and Beru's bodies outside, recognisably dead. The Empire sent stormtroopers to find the droids, traced them to the Lars farm, and apparently killed the occupants. Except stormtroopers throughout the original trilogy don't immolate people, they shoot them. The efficiency of blaster fire is the standard Imperial method. There's no other instance in the films of stormtroopers burning their victims. It's expensive and dramatic and draws attention. The charred bodies are grim even by Star Wars standards. The theory is that Boba Fett did it. In The Empire Strikes Back, Boba Fett is clearly Vader's preferred bounty hunter, the one Vader turns to when he needs something done right. The theory places Boba Fett at the beginning of A New Hope, not just the middle, hired or directed by Vader to find the droids, tracing the trail back to the Lars farm and eliminating the connection in the most permanent and untraceable way available. Stormtroopers were officially there. They could officially get the blame. Boba Fett was never officially anywhere. It also fits his reputation. Boba Fett is established as effective, discreet, and willing to do things Imperial officers prefer not to document. Burning a farmhouse and 2 people in a remote desert with no witnesses is exactly the kind of work he'd be suited for. There's no canonical confirmation of this, and the visual style of the scene matches standard Imperial operations closely enough that it could easily be just stormtroopers following unusual orders. But the theory adds an interesting early presence for Boba Fett and answers the question of why the method was different. Moving to something warmer, Leia's memory of her mother. In Return of the Jedi, Luke asks Leia if she remembers her mother, her real mother. Leia says she has images, feelings. She was very beautiful, kind but sad. Padme Amidala died moments after giving birth to Leia. This is confirmed by multiple sources. Leia couldn't possibly have conscious memories of her. This is either a famous plot inconsistency, the prequels hadn't been made when Return of the Jedi was written, so no one thought to check the math, or, the theory holds, it's something else entirely. Leia is Force sensitive. We know this definitively. The Last Jedi confirms it visually and explicitly. She felt the Force had latent abilities she never fully developed, but the sensitivity was always there. What if what Leia experienced as memories were actually Force visions? Not memories of events she witnessed, but impressions transmitted through her Force connection. A sense of who Padme was, what her emotional state was in the days around the birth. Perhaps images or feelings accessed from the living force rather than from direct experience. She felt her mother without seeing her, the way force sensitives sometimes feel things they shouldn't be able to know. It's a theory that, if confirmed by canon, would be quietly wonderful. It would mean Padme reached her daughter in the only way available to her. It would mean Leia always had something of her mother with her, even without knowing where it came from. And it would smooth over what otherwise sits as a fairly obvious continuity problem in a way that adds emotional resonance rather than just papering over the crack. I've always thought it should be confirmed. It makes the story better, and Star Wars has generally been good at finding ways to make things better, with small additions rather than large retcons. There are a few other smaller theories I want to mention before we move on. Maz Kanata, the small bespectacled alien who runs a castle on Takodana in The Force Awakens, is described as over 1,000 years old, which puts her alive during the Clone Wars and the Old Republic era. She has Luke's lightsaber, a weapon that fell into a cloud city on Bespin in The Empire Strikes Back, and whose recovery is conspicuously unexplained. When asked about it, she says, "A good question for another time. She knows things she doesn't explain." She refers to the Force with the casual familiarity of someone who has spent centuries paying attention to it. The theory that she's a hidden Force sensitive, not a Jedi, not a Sith, something older and more independent, has always felt right to me. It's never been confirmed, but she behaves like someone who's been watching the galaxy's patterns for a very long time and has learned not to make a fuss about it. There's also Chirrut Imwe from Rogue One, the same idea we touched on earlier with the Wills, and faith as a direct channel to the Force. He comes back to mind here because I think he illustrates the point better than almost any other character in the franchise. Not a Jedi, no training, just complete, unshakable trust. And somehow that's enough. That one I believe entirely. Padme Amidala is, across the prequel trilogy, one of the most capable people in the story. She's a former queen who stepped down at the constitutional age limit and became a senator. She fights in a pitched battle on Geonosis in Attack of the Clones. She goes to Mustafar alone to confront Anakin when she thinks she can reach him. She's not, in any reading of the character, someone who gives up, someone who loses the will to live. And yet in Revenge of the Sith, that's what the medical droid tells us happened. She delivered 2 healthy children, and then she simply died. No medical cause. The droid reports that she's lost the will to live. She just stops. Giving birth in a medical facility, surrounded by technology, apparently in no physical danger, and she dies because she's sad. It's the most narratively frustrating death in the saga, and I say that with some genuine feeling about it. Padme deserved better. The character deserved better. And, separately, practically, it makes no medical sense. Lost the will to live is not a cause of death the droid could actually diagnose with its scanners. It's a phrase that describes an emotional state, not a biological process, which is exactly what makes the fan theory interesting. The theory is that Padme didn't die of grief. Palpatine killed her. Specifically, that Palpatine used the Force to drain Padme's life force and transfer it to Anakin, who was dying on a table in the same facility at the same moment following his burning on Mustafar. Here's the sequence. Anakin, now Vader, has been critically injured, burned across most of his body, lungs damaged, limbs lost. Without significant intervention, he would die. Palpatine arrives on Mustafar, recovers him, and takes him to a medical facility on Coruscant for extensive reconstruction into the armor and life support system we know. But the question the film raises implicitly is, how did Anakin survive at all? His injuries were catastrophic. Even with the best medical technology available, it's remarkable that anyone could survive that level of damage. Palpatine told Anakin before the fall, "The dark side can save the ones you love from dying." He made that promise directly. He had just been speaking about midi-chlorian manipulation and the power to prevent death. And then shortly afterward, Anakin makes choices that mean Padme needs the Force Drain technique far more than he does. The theory is that Palpatine used some version of Plagueis' technique, draining life force from one being and transferring it to another to keep Anakin alive by taking what remained of Padme's vital energy. Not violently, not in a way the medical droids could identify, because it's not a biological process. It happens on a cellular force level. She dies because something essential is removed. The droid has no category for that. Lost the will to live is the closest approximation it can generate. This would mean several things. It would mean Padme's death is Palpatine's doing, directly, which is thematically appropriate. He took everything from Anakin, including the person Anakin had given everything to save. It would mean the dark side's promised power to prevent death actually manifested, just not for the person Anakin wanted, and it would give Padme a cause of death that isn't just sadness, which the character deserved. She didn't give up, she was taken. There's an additional layer here that I find quietly devastating. Darth Vader's armor and life support exist in this theory, partly because of Padme's life force. He was kept alive at the cost of her life and spent the next 20 years in a suit that was built around that desperate rescue. He carries her with him in the most literal possible way. Everything that keeps him breathing came at her expense. And he doesn't know this, presumably, unless Palpatine told him at some point as a piece of psychological torture, which honestly seems within his character. George Lucas never confirmed or denied this theory, and it remains fan territory. But the Darth Plagueis scene earlier in the film, the coincidence of the timing, and the sheer implausibility of the lost the will to live diagnosis together make it feel like something Lucas planted deliberately, even if he chose not to close the loop explicitly. It's the kind of suggestion that does its work through implication. The medical droid can't tell you what happened. The Force can, and the Force was busy. The Clone Wars animated series is, across its 7 seasons, an extraordinary piece of Star Wars storytelling. There are arcs in that show that are more emotionally affecting than anything in the films, and there are corners of the lore it explores with a depth and ambition that surprised me when I first watched them. But nothing in the series is quite as strange, quite as ambitious, or quite as philosophically dense as the Mortis arc in Season 3. It's 3 episodes: Overlords, Altar of Mortis, and Ghosts of Mortis. In them, Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka follow a distress signal to an apparently impossible location, a place that doesn't appear to exist in normal space, that seems to pull them in rather than letting them navigate there. When they arrive, they encounter 3 beings: a father, a daughter, and a son. The father is ancient beyond calculation, capable of calm and exhausted. He has spent an unknowable length of time holding the balance between the other 2. The daughter embodies the light side of the Force, pure, radiant, compassionate, and ultimately willing to sacrifice herself. The son embodies the dark side, brilliant, seductive, terrifying, willing to do anything to be free of his father's control. Together, the 3 of them are the Force made manifest. Not a metaphor. Literally, the Force or its physical representatives existing on a plane beyond ordinary understanding. And then the father tests Anakin because Anakin has been prophesied as the chosen one, and the father wants to know if Anakin can do what needs doing when the time comes. Hold the son and daughter in balance, keep the peace, prevent the darkness from breaking free. The arc is beautiful and strange, and ends in tragedy, as most things in Anakin's story do, and leaves Anakin with no memory of what happened there. He forgets everything. The Force takes it back. The theory that has circulated around the Mortis arc since the episodes aired is about what Mortis actually is. One version, Mortis is the origin point of the Force, or at least the place where the Force is closest to having a physical existence. The birthplace of the midi-chlorians that Yoda visits in his own spiritual journey in Season 6 might be the same place, or connected to it. The Mortis of the father, son, and daughter might be the place the wills exist, expressed in a form that living beings can perceive. Another version, the entire Mortis arc was a vision. Not something that physically happened, but something the Force showed Anakin, a projection of the choice he would eventually face, dramatized as 3 characters so he could understand it emotionally rather than abstractly. The father is Anakin's own capacity for balance. The son is the darkness he carries. The daughter is the light. And the whole arc is the Force showing him, in the only language he could receive it in, what his purpose actually is. In Ghosts of Mortis, there's a scene that I think about regularly. The son shows Anakin a vision of the future, what Anakin will become. Darth Vader, the Emperor, the Death Star, everything. He sees all of it. And then the father removes the memory of the vision to prevent Anakin from being driven to the dark side by despair at what he'll become, or from being manipulated by the son using that knowledge as a lever. So Anakin saw his own future. He saw exactly who he would become and exactly what he would do, and then he forgot. Which means that somewhere inside Anakin Skywalker, across all the years that followed, there was a memory that couldn't be accessed consciously, but that the Force had planted there, a knowledge of the destination. Maybe that knowledge is part of why, at the very end of Return of the Jedi, he was able to choose differently, not because he was surprised by an opportunity, because part of him had always known this moment was coming, even if he couldn't say so. I don't know if the showrunners intended that precise reading. The Mortis arc is genuinely ambiguous about what it means, and I think that ambiguity is deliberate, but it's the kind of storytelling that rewards quiet contemplation. The Force is always doing more than the characters can see. Sometimes it shows you the whole story at once, in a dream, and then takes the dream away and lets you live it anyway. There's a particular kind of trust in that, if you believe the Force is benevolent. It doesn't spare Anakin the tragedy, it shows him the tragedy in advance, precisely because the tragedy is also the correction. And the correction is the point. Balance requires the fall and the redemption both. That's a harder kind of love than the straightforward kind. The kind that knows what you'll do and stays anyway. Ahsoka Tano begins her story as a 13-year-old Padawan assigned to Anakin Skywalker without asking. Neither of them is particularly pleased about the arrangement. Anakin is barely old enough for his own Padawan and doesn't want the responsibility. Ahsoka is sharp, quick, and deeply uninterested in being told what to do. What follows across 5 seasons of the Clone Wars and into Rebels and her own series is one of the richest character arcs in the whole franchise. But the piece of Ahsoka's story I want to spend some time on is her lightsabers, and specifically what their colour means. Ahsoka begins with a green lightsaber and a shorter Shoto blade, both standard Jedi configurations. When she eventually returns to active combat in Rebels and her own series, she wields 2 white blades, pure white, not a colour we've seen before or since in the mainstream Star Wars canon. The in-universe explanation, which the canon provides, is that white blades come from kyber crystals that were red, that had been bled by a dark side user and have been healed. Ahsoka takes crystals from an inquisitor she defeats and purifies them. The healing of a bled crystal apparently produces white, not blue or green, which are the natural states. White, something new. The theory about what this means is simple but resonant. Ahsoka is neither Jedi nor Sith. She left the Jedi Order not because she chose the dark side, but because the Order failed her, and she decided that the institution and she were no longer suited to each other. She didn't fall. She walked away, upright, under her own terms, and she continued to use the Force, continued to fight for what she believed in, without claiming membership in either tradition. White blades in this reading represent a third path, the Force without the institution, connection without doctrine, power used in service of something the individual decides on rather than something a council prescribes. The healing of the red crystals is the specific act that produced white, taking something that had been corrupted and making it new, rather than simply restoring it to its original state. You can't unbleed a crystal, you can only do something different with it. There's a conversation in the Clone Wars where Ahsoka, having just left the Order, tells Anakin that she needs to find out who she is apart from the Jedi. Anakin doesn't understand this. He's so completely defined by his identity as a Jedi, even when he's actively failing at being a Jedi by Jedi standards, that the idea of existing without that structure is genuinely incomprehensible to him. Ahsoka, who is the best version of what he was trying to be, understands something about herself that he never manages to, that belonging to an institution isn't the same as having values, and that the two can diverge. The theory extends to the sequel-era material, where Ahsoka appears in The Mandalorian and her own series still wielding those white blades, still operating outside the structures of the Jedi Order and the New Republic alike, still navigating on her own terms. By the time she's fully grown, she's functionally something that Star Wars lore doesn't have a good name for. Not a dark Jedi, she's clearly not dark. Not a grey Jedi. That's a Legends concept that canon has been careful not to adopt directly. Just someone who is strong in the Force and uses it well, without needing the title. And the white blades say all of that, quietly, every time she ignites them. There's a broader theory around Ahsoka that involves whether she survived the events of the Rebels Season 2 finale, a haunting episode called Twilight of the Apprentice, in which she confronts Darth Vader, her former master. The episode ends ambiguously. She walks into a Sith temple, there's a duel, and then we see a figure walk away from the entrance in a way that's either confirmation she survived or a careful visual ambiguity. Later seasons and series confirm she did survive. The world between worlds, a Force dimension outside of linear time, is involved. But in the gap between that episode and those later confirmations, the fan theories about what happened and what it meant were some of the most interesting in the fandom. Ahsoka's survival and her white blades together form a coherent statement about what the Force actually is, separate from the institutions that have historically claimed ownership of it. It was always bigger than the Jedi. The Jedi understood part of it, Ahsoka understands a different part, and the white-bladed figure walking alone at the end of everything might be the clearest image of that the franchise has produced. There's a reading of Return of the Jedi that reframes Palpatine's entire plan in the third act, and once you encounter it, it's genuinely difficult to go back to the simpler version. In the simpler version, Palpatine has set a trap for the Rebel fleet, lured them to Endor with false information about the Death Star 2's completion status, and planned to watch them be destroyed while sitting safely aboard his battle station. He also wants Luke brought before him, because he wants either to convert Luke to the dark side or kill him. The trap is primarily military, the Luke situation is secondary. But here's a different reading. What if the trap wasn't primarily military at all? What if the Rebel fleet was bait, not the target? What if Palpatine's real plan in Return of the Jedi was to engineer a specific sequence of events that would produce a more powerful Sith apprentice than Darth Vader? Let's trace what Palpatine actually says to Luke in those scenes, because when you list it out, it becomes almost comically methodical. He tells Luke he's made a mistake coming to him. He tells Luke that the Rebel fleet will be destroyed. He tells Luke that his friends on Endor will die. He tells Luke that he'll come to the dark side. And he tells Luke at the critical moment that you are beaten, and your friends, up there on the sanctuary moon, are walking into a trap, and invites Luke to take out his hatred. Specifically, invites it. What Palpatine seems to want is for Luke to kill him in a rage, to strike him down in anger, in the grip of dark side emotion, and in doing so, make the dark side conversion complete. Luke, powered by the full emotional charge of watching his friends die and his father suffer, giving into the desire to destroy the Emperor with a blade. That's not a Jedi using the Force, that's a Sith striking down their enemy. And if Luke can be brought to that moment, Palpatine has a new, younger, more powerful apprentice and doesn't need Vader anymore. The theory, articulated by a number of fans and developed in various YouTube essays over the years, is that Palpatine already knew Vader was compromised. That Vader's conversation with Luke on Cloud City, his offer of alliance against Palpatine, had either been sensed by Palpatine through the Force or reported to him through other means. Palpatine knew Vader was going to betray him when the opportunity arose. So Palpatine's plan on the Death Star wasn't to keep Vader, it was to get rid of him and upgrade. This reading makes the Emperor considerably more intelligent and considerably more ruthless. He's not watching events unfold and hoping Luke breaks. He's engineered the specific conditions most likely to break Luke. The fleet, the Endor deaths, Vader's suffering, all of it is calculated to bring Luke to the emotional state where he'll do exactly what Palpatine wants. What foiled it, in this theory, is something Palpatine couldn't have calculated. That Anakin Skywalker was still in there. Not Vader, but Anakin. That watching his son be tortured triggered something that overrode 20 years of conditioning. Palpatine's plan required Vader to remain a Sith until Luke made the dark side conversion, at which point Palpatine could discard him. But Vader broke the timeline. He acted before Luke fully broke, interrupting the sequence Palpatine had so carefully arranged. The irony is extraordinary. Palpatine's plan failed because he overestimated his own work. He thought he had fully converted Anakin Skywalker. He hadn't. The thing he needed to suppress, the capacity for love, the attachment to family, was still there, dormant under 20 years of armor and conditioning, and it woke up at exactly the wrong moment. This is also, if you follow the reading through, why Palpatine's lightning focuses on Luke rather than on Vader when Vader lifts him. He can't stop Vader using the Force. Vader is too strong and too close, but he can try to finish Luke quickly enough that Vader's action becomes pointless. It doesn't work. Vader gets him into the shaft, but Palpatine's targeting priority in those final seconds is Luke, not Vader. It's a small detail, but in a film as carefully constructed as Return of the Jedi, small details are worth sitting with. I don't know if the filmmakers intended this reading. I suspect the simpler version is what was consciously in mind, but the evidence supports it well enough that it functions as a second layer, a subtler story running underneath the one on the surface. And that's the kind of thing that makes decades-old films feel new when you go looking. Throughout the Star Wars films, the Force is described in different ways by different characters at different times. Obi-Wan in A New Hope gives the classic description, an energy field created by all living things that surrounds us, penetrates us, and binds the galaxy together. Yoda in The Last Jedi pushes back on the idea that the Force is the exclusive property of the Jedi. It does not belong to them. The midi-chlorian framework, introduced in the prequels, adds the biological layer, microscopic organisms, as the interface between organic life and this universal energy. But there's a thread in the lore, particularly as the sequel trilogy develops it, that treats the Force as something more intentional than any of these descriptions fully captures. Not just an energy field, something with preferences, something that pairs things. The concept of a Force dyad appears in The Rise of Skywalker, where it's described as two people sharing a unique bond in the Force. A dyad in the Force, a power like life itself. In the film, Rey and Kylo Ren are described as a dyad, an extraordinarily rare bond that produces unusual abilities in both of them. They can communicate across vast distances, touch each other's hands across space, transfer objects through their connection. It's the most intimate Force bond the saga has shown. But the theory worth discussing here is older than that, and concerns a different aspect of the Force's apparent tendency toward pairing. The concept of a vergence, a place where the Force is unusually concentrated or where it forms around a specific person, is introduced in The Phantom Menace when Qui-Gon finds Anakin. The midi-chlorians had gathered around the boy, as if drawn there. He stood at a vergence in the Force, This is later echoed in the description of Dagobah, which is a powerful force vergence because of Yoda's long presence there, and also because of something dark beneath the surface, the dark side cave. What the broader theory proposes is that the Force doesn't just strengthen around important people or places. It pairs, it creates counterweights. The existence of one extraordinarily powerful Force user generates or attracts a counterpart, Anakin and Palpatine, who shaped each other across the saga. Yoda and the dark cave on Dagobah, which contains a vision of what Yoda might have become. Luke and Vader, whose bond runs deeper than biology. Rey and Kylo, explicitly a dyad. The Force in this reading is always working toward equilibrium, not static balance, not equal amounts of light and dark standing still, but dynamic, relational balance. Every extraordinary Force user calls into being, or is called by, their opposite number. The prophecy of the Chosen One isn't about a single person eliminating one side. It's about the Force finding the specific pair that can finally bring the dynamic to rest. And if that's true, then the story of Anakin and Palpatine is the story of a pair that nearly destroyed everything before the correction could happen. The story of Luke and Vader is the story of a pair that finally did it. And the story of Rey and Kylo is something more complicated. Two sides of the same Force dyad, whose resolution required one to die and one to go on. I think about the Force dyad concept in the context of what R2-D2 has been watching, patiently, across all these films. The same dynamic, the same pattern, the same pairing phenomenon expressing itself across generations. The Force finding balance the only way it apparently can, through individuals, through relationships, through specific bonds that carry the weight of the whole galaxy's equilibrium in them. It's a lot to ask of any two people. There's a related theory about what the dark side cave on Dagobah actually is. When Luke enters it in The Empire Strikes Back, Yoda tells him he'll find what he takes with him. Luke takes his weapons. He encounters a vision of Darth Vader that he kills, only to see his own face beneath the mask. The standard reading is that this is a warning. Luke carries darkness within him, and if he takes the path of anger and violence, he becomes what he's fighting. But there's another reading in which the cave is showing him not what he could become, but what he is. That Luke and Vader are already the same person in the Force's reckoning. Different expressions of the same soul, the same energy, the same dyad already in existence before Luke has ever consciously connected with it. Vader's helmet turning to reveal Luke's face in the vision might not be a warning about a possible future. It might be an accurate statement about the present. They're already twinned, already in relationship, already the pair that the Force needs. Luke just doesn't know it yet. Yoda, who sent him in there, knew what the cave contained. He said only, "What you take with you." He did not say, "What might be true." He knew the cave would show Luke something true. That's not nothing. Yoda, as we know by this point, had been doing quite a lot of quiet, careful work for a very long time, setting pieces into positions that might eventually produce the correction the Force needed. He didn't tell Luke everything. He told Luke enough, at each moment, to make the next right move possible. In that reading, the dark side cave on Dagobah isn't a warning at all. It's an introduction. Yoda is, in almost every appearance across the saga, doing several things at once. The most visible thing, giving advice, moving calmly through an impossible situation, speaking in that particular syntax that has become one of the most recognizable patterns in cinema, is rarely the most important thing. Consider what Yoda actually tells people and what he leaves out. He tells Obi-Wan that Anakin is too old to begin training and is overruled. He tells Anakin that attachment is the path to the dark side, in a way that completely misses what Anakin actually needs to hear, which is something more like, "Your fear of loss is understandable. Here is how to hold love without clinging to it. Here is how to grieve without being destroyed by it." He doesn't say that. He says the attachment itself is the problem, which is both true and profoundly inadequate, given the specific person he's talking to. There's a theory that Yoda knew his approach with Anakin was wrong. Not at the time. At the time, he probably believed he was giving sound Jedi doctrine. But during his 19 years of exile on Dagobah, meditating, communing with Qui-Gon, watching what the galaxy became after his failures, he understood something. He saw where the doctrine had broken down. He saw the gap between what the Jedi preached about attachment and what the Jedi actually needed to teach about it. And then Luke arrives, and Yoda teaches him differently. Watch how Yoda talks to Luke versus how Yoda talked to Anakin. With Anakin, he's formal, careful, doctrinally precise. He delivers rulings from a position of institutional authority. With Luke, he sits in the mud and pretends to be a harmless old creature. He teases, tests, cajoles. He connects. He teaches through story and through direct personal experience, rather than through the recitation of Jedi principle. Most significantly, when Luke says he's not afraid, Yoda says, "You will be, you will be." When Luke says he knows the risks of facing Vader, Yoda doesn't tell him not to feel anything about it. He just says he's not ready. He doesn't try to strip Luke of the attachment to his friends that drives him to leave Dagobah early. He warns him, but he lets him make the choice. And I've always found that more affecting than any formal Jedi teaching in the whole saga. Just a very old being, sitting in the dark, choosing to let someone walk into something dangerous because he trusts them enough to. The theory is that Yoda had internalized, in exile, that the Jedi doctrine of non-attachment had been wrong, or rather, that it had been taught wrong, enforced wrong, used as a suppression mechanism rather than as a genuine path. He'd seen what suppressing Anakin's emotions had produced. He wasn't going to make the same mistake with Luke. He was going to let Luke be a person, with connections and fears and love, and trust that those things could coexist with the Force, rather than contaminating it. That's a significant philosophical revision from an institution that had spent 1,000 years doing it the other way. There's also the question of what Yoda knows and chooses not to share at different moments. On Dagobah, he and Obi-Wan are clearly managing Luke, choosing what to tell him and when, and specifically choosing to tell him that Vader is his father only after Luke already knows it, to let Obi-Wan's admission about the truth come at a moment when Luke can receive it. Yoda says, in that same scene, that when he is gone, Luke will be the last of the Jedi. He doesn't mention Leia. He doesn't say, "Your sister is strong in the Force. She could also carry this. You're not alone in the way you think you are." He leaves that for Luke to figure out himself. Why? The theory is that Yoda understood Luke's character well enough to know that telling him he had backup would change what he did. Luke had to go to Vader believing the entire weight of the Jedi was on his shoulders. That specific weight was what would bring him to the confrontation with the right disposition. Not to fight, but to try to save his father. If he'd known Leia existed, if he'd known the lineage continued in another form, the calculation might have been different. Yoda's withholding of information in this reading isn't dishonesty. It's a kind of precision, telling people exactly what they need to know and nothing more at exactly the moment they need to know it, which is either wisdom or manipulation, depending on your perspective, and possibly both. He does, at the end of Return of the Jedi, smile, standing in the forest on Endor with Obi-Wan and Anakin, shimmering and blue. It's the smile of someone who saw something turn out correctly, after a very long time of not being sure it would. Dignified relief, maybe, or just satisfaction. He'd been working toward that moment for a long time, watching, placing, waiting, and in the end, the Force did what it needed to do. The Force Awakens opens, essentially, 30 years after Return of the Jedi, with the galaxy in a state that requires some explaining. The Empire has fallen, the Rebellion won, the New Republic has been established. And yet there is already a new version of the Empire, the First Order, that is heavily armed, clearly organized for some time, and in possession of a weapon capable of destroying entire star systems. The Resistance, fighting the First Order, appears to be a small scrappy outfit rather than the military arm of the New Republic. The film moves quickly enough that you might not pause on the weirdness of this setup, but pause on it and it becomes genuinely strange. If the New Republic won the war and has been governing the galaxy for 30 years, how does a faction with this kind of military capacity exist? Where did the resources come from? Why is the New Republic apparently watching rather than fighting? Why is the Resistance, rather than the Republic's own military, doing the actual work? The canon material, particularly the novel Bloodline by Claudia Gray, which I genuinely recommend, fills this in considerably. The New Republic, after decades of war and imperial rule, had a strong ideological current that was deeply uncomfortable with large-standing militaries, which honestly makes complete sense. The entire rebellion was built on resisting exactly that kind of centralized power. You can't win a war against a military empire and then immediately build your own without some serious questions being asked. So the New Republic decentralized. It allowed member systems to maintain their own defenses rather than building a unified galactic fleet. It prioritized demilitarization as a value and on a philosophical level that was coherent and even admirable. The First Order, meanwhile, was what remained of the Empire. Officers, crew, loyalists who retreated to the unknown regions rather than surrendering, using territory the New Republic didn't govern and resources that weren't tracked. They rebuilt slowly, quietly, over decades, while the New Republic debated and deliberated and remained comfortable. The theory that connects this to the broader saga is simple. Palpatine planned for this too. The retreat to the unknown regions isn't the improvised survival strategy of a defeated faction. The unknown regions had been Palpatine's project for years before the fall of the Empire. The Thrawn novels in canon established that Palpatine had been funding expeditions into the unknown regions specifically to find something there. What he found, the canon hints, was the Sith Eternal, the cult that eventually produced the fleet of planet destroyers in The Rise of Skywalker, and the path to his own continued survival in cloned form. The First Order in this reading wasn't an accident of history. It was a contingency. Palpatine knew he might be killed. He arranged for the Empire's military capacity to relocate to territory he controlled, where it could rebuild under the guidance of loyal officers, and where it would be waiting when he was ready to return. The 30-year gap isn't failure. It's a construction period. This makes the Force Awakens opening situation considerably less convenient and considerably more chilling. The galaxy didn't fumble a victory and let a new threat rise by accident. It was set up to fail from the beginning, by someone who had been playing the longest game in galactic history. There's a smaller theory nested inside this one that I find particularly interesting, that Supreme Leader Snoke's specific influence on Ben Solo was always part of the plan. If Palpatine created Snoke as a proxy and directed Snoke to corrupt Han and Leia's son, then the creation of Kylo Ren is another piece of Palpatine's arrangement, ensuring that the Skywalker bloodline, which twice disrupted his plans, would be turned against itself in the third generation. He didn't just want the First Order's military, he wanted the most Force-sensitive family in the galaxy, either on his side or destroyed. He almost got both. What strikes me about this level of the Star Wars story is how it asks you to reconsider history. The Empire's fall in Return of the Jedi feels, in the moment, like a genuine ending. The celebration on Endor, the fireworks across the galaxy, the warmth of Leia and Han and Luke together, it feels finished. But the story is telling you, with the benefit of sequel hindsight, that it wasn't. That the person who looked defeated had been arranging his own comeback from before the moment of defeat. That the galaxy's victory was real and deserved but incomplete, and that the Force would need to run the whole sequence again through a new generation before it could finally be done. Which is either a deeply cynical comment on the persistence of fascism and the difficulty of defeating it thoroughly, or a narrative argument that some corrections require more than one attempt. Possibly both. Star Wars has usually been more interested in hope than in despair, so I lean toward the second reading, but the first one is there. Before I let this meander to a close, a few smaller things that have been sitting in my mind. There's a theory about Luke's green lightsaber, the one he builds between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, that it might use Qui-Gon Jinn's Kyber crystal, the one from Qui-Gon's blue blade that was presumably lost after his death on Naboo. It would create a beautiful, quiet connection between Qui-Gon, who started the whole Skywalker chain of events by finding Anakin, and Luke, who ended it by saving him. The theory has been explicitly contradicted by canon at this point. We know where Luke's crystal came from, and it isn't Qui-Gon's. But I still love the idea. Some theories are worth carrying around, even after they've been disproved. There's also the question of what happens to Grogu, the character everyone knows as Baby Yoda, in the long arc of Star Wars history. Grogu is 50 years old in the Mandalorian's timeline, which places his birth around the time of the prequel era. He was in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant when Order 66 was executed. Someone saved him. We don't know who. There's a whole story about that night, about who got a 50-year-old, being who couldn't speak or walk yet, out of a building full of dying Jedi. And it hasn't been told yet. The theories range from specific Jedi we know, Mace Windu in one popular version, to entirely new characters, to a coincidence of circumstance. The fact that it hasn't been revealed yet, years into the Mandalorian era of storytelling, suggests either that the reveal is being saved for something significant, or that the creative team hasn't decided yet, or both. I hope it gets an answer eventually. It's the kind of question that deserves one. And then there's the thing that I always come back to at the end of this kind of wondering. The fact that the saga, however it was made, however inconsistent some of its connective tissue is, coheres emotionally in a way that continues to sustain interest and theory crafting decades after the first film. You can point to plot holes. You can find the seams where the films weren't planned as a single story. You can disagree with choices made in any individual entry. All of that is true, and yet people are still, in 2024, watching A New Hope and noticing something new in the way Obi-Wan looks when Han Solo boasts about the Kessel Run, still finding patterns in the prequels that feel like they were put there deliberately, still building theories that make the whole thing feel more coherent and more beautiful than any of its parts individually manage. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Star Wars is, whatever else it is, a story that has held the attention of multiple generations of people and given them something worth wondering about. There are very few stories you can say that about with genuine confidence. This is one of them. I have a list as long as my arm of topics for future videos in this vein. Character deep dives, the entire lore of the High Republic era, and how it connects to the fall of the Jedi, a proper exploration of the Mortis arc's full implications, the music of John Williams, and the specific ways certain themes recur and evolve, and what that tells you about the story. A deep dive into the Mandalorian people and their long, complicated relationship with the Jedi, the Inquisitors, and what it means that the Empire specifically turned former Jedi into hunters of their own kind. The question of what the Force actually looks like, from the inside, from the perspective of beings like the daughter and son on Mortis. There's no shortage of material, and I find I'm never bored by any of it. For tonight, though, there's one last thing I want to spend a little time on before I actually stop. And then I will genuinely stop. The last thing I want to spend some time on is the question of Rey's choice at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. When the old woman on Tatooine asks her name, Rey pauses and then says, "Skywalker." This has been debated quite vigorously since the film came out. Critics of the choice point out that Rey is a Palpatine by blood, and that choosing the Skywalker name feels like it erases her actual lineage rather than transcending it. There's also the argument that the Skywalker family name, belonging to Anakin and Luke and Leia, wasn't hers to take, that it diminishes the weight of that name by attaching it to someone outside the bloodline. I understand those arguments, but there's a reading of that moment that I find more satisfying than either the celebratory version or the critical one. The theory goes like this. Throughout the Skywalker saga, names have carried enormous weight, and the acquisition or abandonment of names has been one of the saga's primary ways of marking transformation. Anakin became Darth Vader and lost his name. Luke refused to become a different person and kept his. Ben Solo reclaimed his name in dying. Rey, who was raised with no family name at all, who was just Rey, nothing else, a person defined by absence. Choosing a name at the end of the story isn't about claiming a bloodline. It's about claiming a tradition. The Skywalker name by the end of the saga doesn't primarily mean descended from Shmi Skywalker. It means something more like someone who chose the light, who faced the dark side, who carried the weight of the galaxy's balance and didn't break under it. Luke Skywalker became that name's primary meaning. Leia Organa, who carried it in a different form, added to it. And Rey, who was trained by both of them, who carries their knowledge and their connection to the Force, is choosing to affiliate with what that name has come to represent, rather than with her actual bloodline. She's not saying she's a Skywalker descendant. She's saying she's of that tradition, that school, that way of approaching the Force. It's not that different, in principle, from a student taking on their teacher's name in various traditions of practice that exist in the real world. There's also a specific detail that I think supports this reading. The moment just before she says the name, she sees the Force spirits of Luke and Leia. They're with her, and the name she chooses is theirs, not because she's entitled to it, but because they are offering it. It's a gift, and she accepts it. Whether the scene fully earns that moment is a question of execution and personal taste. And I have my own views on the rise of Skywalker that I'll spare you from getting into at length at this particular hour. But the theory of what Rey's name choice means, the idea that the Skywalker name has become a vocation rather than a bloodline, is one that makes the ending feel more intentional and more thematically complete than it sometimes gets credit for. Names matter a lot in Star Wars. Anakin's name surviving secretly in Vader. Luke refusing to become someone else, even when everything pressured him to. Ahsoka, who has no surname at all and doesn't need one, who is simply and completely herself. Rey finally becoming someone at the end of the story by choosing which tradition she belongs to. The saga is full of people who had their names taken from them. People who chose new names as acts of power or concealment. People who carried names as burdens, and people who earned names through what they chose to do rather than through who they were born as. Rey Skywalker at the end of it all, standing in the desert where it began, watching twin suns set, choosing is a fitting way to close the loop. I hope it's been pleasant company. I hope the galaxy far, far away has been a good place to spend a few quiet hours. These are old stories now, told across generations, still finding new people who see something in them that matters, and still giving long-time fans new things to notice on 100th watch. That's a fairly remarkable thing for a film to manage. The Force, whatever it actually is, wills and midi-chlorians and the will of something ancient and patient, seems to have a sense of humour about persisting. Sleep well.